The night the snow began to fall sideways, Eli Turner realized the prairie could still surprise him. He had lived most of his 42 years on land that stretched so wide it taught a man humility whether he wanted the lesson or not. He'd ridden fence lines under blistering suns, slept beneath stars so sharp they seemed to hum, and learned to listen to the weather the way other men listened to sermons. Yet that night, as the wind cut across the plains and pressed against his coat like a living thing, he felt a pull he couldn't explain, a tug not from the sky, but from somewhere closer to the ground, somewhere human. Eli was headed home after a long day mending a broken gate at the far edge of the Bartee Ranch. His horse, Boone, moved steadily, hooves crunching through fresh snow that glowed faintly beneath a moon half hidden by clouds. The world was quiet in that way only winter could manage, no birds, no insects, just the breath of the land itself. Eli liked that silence. It made space for thoughts he usually kept buried. Thoughts of the wife he'd lost years earlier, of a life that had narrowed into routines because routines hurt less than remembering. Then he heard it. At first, it sounded like the wind changing direction. A thin, wavering sound that rose and fell, almost lost in the gusts. Eli slowed Boone, cocking his head. He listened again. The sound came once more, sharper this time, unmistakable. Crying. Not the cry of an animal, but the fragile, uneven sobs of children. Eli's hand tightened on the reins. Out here, miles from the nearest town, children had no business being in the snow after dark. He turned Boone toward the sound, urging him forward through drifts that rose higher the farther he went. The crying grew clearer, breaking into desperate gasps that pulled at something deep inside him, a place he'd learned not to visit too often. He crested a small rise and saw them. A narrow shack sat crooked against the white expanse, its roof sagging, one shutter hanging loose and banging softly in the wind. A thin ribbon of smoke tried, and failed, to escape a cracked chimney. Huddled against the door were 3 children, bundled in coats too thin for the night, their faces red and wet with tears. The youngest, no more than 4, clutched a ragged blanket. The oldest, a girl of maybe 10, stood protectively in front, her arms wrapped around her siblings as if her small body could shield them from the cold itself. Eli swung down from his horse without thinking. His boots hit the snow hard, and the children flinched, eyes wide with fear. "Hey," he said gently, holding up his hands. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The girl studied him, her gaze sharp despite her shaking. "Mama said not to open the door for strangers." "That's good advice," Eli replied, nodding. "You did right." The boy in the middle sobbed louder. "Mama won't wake up," he cried. Eli's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The girl swallowed. "She's inside. She told us to wait by the door 'cause it was warmer here. She said she'd come out in a minute. But she didn't." Eli felt the weight of the night press down on him. He stepped past the children carefully and pushed the door open. Inside, the shack was colder than the outdoors somehow, the fire long dead. A woman lay on a narrow bed, her face pale, her hair spread like dark ink against the pillow. Eli knew before he touched her that she was gone. The stillness was too complete, too final. He closed his eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. When he stepped back outside, the children were watching him with desperate hope. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Your mama, she's gone." The girl's face crumpled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened, her jaw set in a way that broke Eli's heart. "What do we do now?" Eli looked around. The snow was falling harder, the wind howling like a warning. There was no time for long explanations or careful plans. "You come with me," he said. "All of you. Right now." The girl hesitated. "Mama said." "I know," Eli interrupted gently. "But your mama wanted you safe. And I can do that." For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then the girl nodded. Eli lifted the youngest onto Boone, wrapped in his own heavy coat. The other 2 climbed up behind, clinging to each other. Eli led the horse, breaking a path through the snow, his legs burning from the cold and effort. He didn't stop until the lights of the Bartee Ranch cut through the darkness like a promise. The ranch house was warm, alive with the crackle of a fire and the smell of coffee. Eli settled the children near the hearth, piling blankets around them until their shivering slowed. He poured hot broth into chipped mugs and watched as they drank, color slowly returning to their faces. "What are your names?" he asked. "I'm Clara," the girl said. "This is Samuel and Rosie." Eli nodded. "I'm Eli." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand words. Eli felt something shift inside him, a door he'd nailed shut creaking open. He'd lived alone for so long, convinced solitude was easier. But as Rosie fell asleep against his arm and Samuel stared into the fire with exhausted eyes, Eli realized how wrong he'd been. The next morning, the storm had buried the world in white. Eli hitched up the wagon and drove to town with the children bundled beside him. The sheriff helped make arrangements, contacting the small network of social services that stretched thin across the county. There were questions, forms, plans made in hushed voices. Temporary placement, the sheriff said gently. Until we can find relatives or a long-term solution. Eli nodded, his chest tight. Temporary. The word echoed in his head. That night, the house felt unbearably quiet again. Eli sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs. He thought of Clara's steady bravery, of Samuel's quiet fear, of Rosie's small hand wrapped trustingly around his finger. He remembered the night he'd lost his wife, the way kindness from strangers had carried him through days he hadn't thought survivable. A casserole left on his porch. A neighbor fixing a fence without being asked. Small mercies that had meant everything. Eli stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and drove back to town. I'll take them, he told the social worker. At least for now. She studied him. It won't be easy. I know, he said. But it's right. The children returned to the ranch that evening, their eyes lighting up at the familiar sight of Boone and the warm glow of the house. Over the following weeks, the ranch changed. Laughter echoed where silence had lived. Boots too small lined the door. Eli learned how to braid hair badly and how to tell stories that made children forget their grief, if only for a moment. But it wasn't all easy. Clara woke from nightmares, calling for her mother. Samuel grew angry at small things, his grief bursting out in sudden storms. Rosie clung to Eli, afraid he might disappear too. There were days Eli doubted himself, days the weight of responsibility pressed so hard he could barely breathe. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Eli sat alone on the porch, staring at the stars. Clara stepped out quietly and sat beside him. "You're tired," she said. Eli smiled sadly. "Yeah, a bit. You don't have to keep us," she said, her voice small. "If it's too much." Eli turned to her, surprised. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged. "People leave. They always do." Eli felt something inside him settle, solid and sure. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I can't replace your mama. But I can stay." Clara nodded, leaning her head against his arm. "That's enough," she whispered. Spring came slowly, melting the snow into rivers that fed the land. Eli planted a small garden with the children, teaching them how to press seeds into the earth and trust in what they couldn't see. They planted flowers by the shack where their mother had lived, marking the place with care and love instead of sorrow. Months turned into a year. No relatives came forward. The social worker visited, smiling at the sight of the children thriving. Papers were signed, promises made official. On the day the adoption became final, Eli stood in the courthouse, his hands trembling as he signed his name. Clara squeezed his hand, her smile bright and unburdened. Samuel grinned, pride shining in his eyes. Rosie giggled, more interested in the echo of her laughter than the weight of the moment. That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner at the ranch. As they sat together, the fire casting warm light across their faces, Eli felt a fullness he hadn't known was possible. The past still existed, loss didn't vanish, but it no longer defined the edges of his life. Later, after the children were asleep, Eli stepped outside. The sky was clear, the stars steady and kind. He thought of the night he'd heard crying in the snow, of how close he'd come to riding past, to telling himself it was none of his business. He understood now that compassion often arrived disguised as interruption. That the moments which changed us most were rarely planned. And that family wasn't always born. It was sometimes chosen, forged in the quiet courage of staying when leaving would be easier. Inside the house, 3 children slept safely, dreaming of a future no longer shadowed by fear. Eli smiled, his breath fogging in the cold air. Kindness, he realized, was like a light in the storm. It didn't stop the snow from falling, but it showed the way home.